5 hours later.
For decades now, loading screens were an unavoidable part of gaming. They weren't just pauses, they were opportunities for creativity and world building. But as technology advances and changes, the load times shrunk, and now we're watching an iconic piece of game design just slowly disappear. In the early era around the 1980s, there was cassette tapes and floppy disks, games that loaded from slow magnetic media, which was a process that could take 5 to 45 minutes. This did quickly change though. Nintendo began to utilize ROM cartridges in consoles like the NES and SNES, allowing for very fast data access, eliminating any need for load times during gameplay, but lacked much space for memory, which soon transitioned to optical media like CDs and DVDs around the mid-90s. This offered a much more forgiving storage capacity, but gave far slower data access speeds compared to cartridges, which brought back the necessity of loading screens. Originally, it started out as basic progress bars or basic animations. It was mostly used to assure players that the game was working and it hadn't crashed, so they knew that they was waiting for something. Developers started incorporating other aspects, like gameplay tips, character bios, lore snippets, maps, just little things to keep players engaged and informed while the game was loading in the background. Namco also held a patent on the concept of a playable minigame during loading screens, which ran until 2015, which heavily discouraged other companies from using full minigames during loading screens. But other developers used hidden loading screens by designing game levels with narrow corridors, elevators, or slow adventuring to stream data in the background seamlessly. Modern game development, especially for large open world titles, relies heavily on streaming assets in the background during normal gameplay to create an experience with no load times. And with the introduction of solid-state drives becoming the new standard, when load times were needed, it was reduced from minutes to seconds. But why do loading screens actually matter, and why do creative loading screens matter? Well, like I mentioned about the hidden loading screens, using slow movement areas to hide the game loading the textures in the background, but this can only be applicable in some cases, and sometimes chunks of data are too large to seamlessly load. Modern games do this frequently, like in Tomb Raider, God of War, Uncharted. It's typically adventure games where you find this. The most clever example would be the notorious Resident Evil door levels. The slow door opening between levels while entering a new room builds suspense. It succeeds in keeping players immersed with a sense of adventure rather than break it up with a loading screen. It's smart but not always applicable, which is where creativity really begins to shine. Sometimes loading screens are inevitable. There's way too much to process at once, so developers do like to get creative and add an extra bit of fun. There's interactive loading screens that adds a fun minigame or gimmick separate from the game's events, like Dragon Ball Budokai. Imagine playing Dragon Ball minigames while you're waiting for the actual game to load. In Mario 64, you can play around with Mario's face. In Starfield, you can see the photos that you've taken within the game. There is one series that's taken a different approach, which is Assassin's Creed. Before loading the game, the player is put in the Animus, and allows you to control the characters and practice movement and parkour while the game loads. And expanding on this freedom idea was Bayonetta, which takes the same approach but adds the combo movesets on the screen, which allows you to practice movement and combos. It's a fun distraction that gives the player a chance to practice and make their run of the game more enjoyable. There's some games that like to display tips and tricks to fill its loading screens to give the player some deeper insight to the game. And a big example of this is Zelda or Minecraft. Minecraft has a lot to learn, so these tips are actually useful. This is a very common trend across every genre of video games, so there's way too many to list. And there are games which just expand world building. GTA 5 expands its world by displaying in-game characters, but this game's memory is so large, loading times can take a lifetime. When you boot up Skyrim or enter new areas, players are introduced to loading screens that display fully rendered 3D models of weapons, armor, and other creatures. It's just lore drops. You can rotate and inspect these objects and play around while you wait to load into the world. World building in loading screens can be crucial to expand story elements that don't have the time to be focused on with a short budget. So to combat this, in the Afro Samurai game, they use loading screens to depict horror moments from its story. And it's also got eerie voices and just really creepy sound effects, like they're actually a bit creepy. As short as some loading screens might be, in Spider-Man 2 the loading screens feature Peter or Miles as hanging on the subway interacting with civilians, like it's just another day in their lives. It's something that's very small, but it's also very believable. It's just a chance to relax. Sometimes games often lack that extra incentive after taking a break. Quite often when you return in the middle of the game after so long, you can feel lost and confused, which is a good opportunity to take advantage of loading screens that recap the story or give context to what's ahead. Dragon Quest XI likes to recap the story so far when opening your save data, so no matter what type of break you take, you'll always be filled in on what's happening before you even begin the game. Very similar to this is LEGO Star Wars. At the beginning of every level, a cutscene plays, explaining the context of the level in the same way the movies do, so you always begin with extra knowledge of the level while the game loads in the background. And very similar to this is the Call of Duty campaigns. They always begin with a cutscene explaining the current events, time, location of the level, giving you context of what you're about to play, all whilst the level is actually loading. But I think the best and most impressive example is in The Witcher 3, simply because its story recap is voiced too, reeling you further into the story with a great narrator explaining the events while you wait for the game to load. It's a very smart way to support players just in case they missed an important part of the story or took a long break, which is inevitable. We're all going to take breaks and do something else. The devs of these games really do care about your experience and care about bringing you back. Some loading screens like to mask the load time to build immersion and stir the player's emotion. Similar to the first examples I gave at the beginning of this video when I mentioned some data chunks are just too large to mask. Well, to combat this issue without breaking the tension in some games with a loading screen or a story recap, some games like to make it feel seamless when it's also not, but in Ratchet & Clank, their direction adds more emotional resonance to the journey. These games already have great world building and amazing planets to explore, but to load into the planet, you get a sequence of the duo flying their ship across space, slowly closing in and landing onto the planet. This small change adds more intensity and drama to the planet as well. It makes it feel like a much larger adventure, so you're not just jumping from one planet to the other, you see the takeoff, you see the flying, and you see the landing. And very similar to this would be the drop pod sequence in Helldivers 2, which just drops you headfirst onto the battle. It creates an extra bit of hype, and adds the same intensity as it does in Ratchet & Clank. It just leads you into what's coming while the game loads. Honestly, a good loading screen is as important as a toilet. Some of you might be thinking it's just a loading screen, it doesn't really matter. Well, you wouldn't want to go to a restaurant if it has disgusting toilets, would you? Even if you are there to just eat. The way loading screens are treated shows the value of the developers. Just imagine you're in a nice restaurant, but the toilet's the most disgusting pig hole you've ever set foot in. It won't lessen your dining, but it would tarnish your opinion on the restaurant as a whole. And compare that to an average restaurant with a nice, clean, aesthetic toilet, especially when it's a themed restaurant with themed restrooms. I love those ones, and it just heightens your experience. Those who like to carefully treat the lesser important parts of a project are those who care the deepest. Loading screens may have been born from hardware limitations, but they became more than just dead time. They were moments of creativity, storytelling, and sometimes play. As they fade into history, developers might find new ways to create those intentional pauses that make games more memorable. I really hope they stick around. Loading screens may be getting shorter and almost non-existent in some games, but I don't think they're going anywhere for a long time. And it's always nice to take a second to breathe and appreciate the creativity of some devs during this wait time. You should click on one of these videos before they disappear. And everything I've discussed in this video, the disappearance of loading screens raises a design question. Should every moment actually be optimized? Or is there value in slowing down and just breathing? Carefully crafted pauses can help pacing and just give you time to reflect on something you care about. And modern games that we're getting nowadays is risking losing this amazing aspect.